and the beginnings of the New Left. I was wondering if you could explore further the framework out of which that grew, and then some of the successes of the New Left and the failures of the New Left.
It would be very interesting just to step back even a few years from the 60s and give, I suppose, people a sense of how in the 1950s people began to look old radicals, and by that time I guess I could have called myself an old radical after my experiences in the 30s and 40s, how old radicals like myself perhaps looked at the Eisenhower era when Elvis Presley was king, golf was the favorite sport in the United States, suburbia was regarded as the Athens, as it were, of American culture, to give you some sense of how people like myself looked at the situation, because the New Left was an extremely complex and stormy phenomenon that followed from the 1950s. I think enough has been said and written about the 1950s and the Eisenhower era to indicate that America had gone into at least a sizable portion of America had gone into an extremely affluent period, or at least a period of rising expectations. People expected to do better all the time with every passing year. They expected to have more comfortable lives, and a literature began to come out addressing itself to the new forms of automation, as it was called, indicating that it would soon be possible not only to have almost free electrical power from nuclear power plants, that was one of the great myths of that era, but additionally that automation would begin to reduce working hours, people would have to do less work, would have more time for leisure, and machines would in great measure provide us with the abundance and and satisfy the rising expectations that were felt throughout the entire country. I may say that this feeling existed not only among whites, but also people of color. In fact, one of the most impelling factors in what was to become the civil rights movement was the feeling that blacks, people of color, African Americans, were not getting their fair share of the enormous material wealth that was being generated in the 1950s, and were not faced with the prospect of enjoying it in the decade to come, the 1960s. And this produced, unknown to many people, including myself, a sense of rising expectations among oppressed people in the United States. A feeling that they, too, should have access to the goodies that were being produced by this consumer society and the leisure time that machinery, automatic machinery, automation specifically, would produce. So we lived in a very strange period where on the one hand it appeared from a social point of view and even from a cultural point of view that the United States was now going to become smug, that the revolutionary era was over, that the future of the left was something that belonged, was a myth, that it really was something in the past when there was depression, class conflict, and intense social unrest, which certainly marked, almost on a revolutionary scale even in the United States, marked the 1930s. We thought we were going to be the last revolutionaries, let's put it that way, and that each generation which would fulfill George Orwell's image of greater and greater co-optation into the system, greater and greater stability, and greater totalitarianism in all aspects of life. And a gray, mediocre culture of self-satisfied people who would be under the complete control of the bourgeoisie and of the state. The one thing that first broke that image, that Orwellian image of ever greater adaptation, that dystopian image even presented in Brave New World by Aldous Huxley years earlier, was the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. In 1956, suddenly young people who had lived entirely under a Stalinist regime broke out into open revolt. They went ahead and they literally insurrected, took up arms, and for a period of time it seemed, roughly about a week or two, that Hungary was going to free itself, and not only free itself from Russian control and cause the Russian army to leave, which it did, fled from Hungary in a sense, because it was quite demoralized, but additionally establish a kind of socialistic society that would be democratic. And that was what was most magnificent about the Hungarian Revolution. Councils were being formed all over Hungary at that point, and we thought that these new democratic type of councils, or as Lenin and the Russians had called them, Soviets, would no longer have the totalitarian character that existed under the Stalinist regime. And then when the Russian army came in and crushed the Hungarian Revolution in blood, we were despondent, and we were very deeply moved. I got personally very much involved in supporting that revolution. I wrote a leaflet on it called Arms to Hungary, in which I favored virtually airdrops to the Hungarian revolutionaries who were crying over the radio, and we could hear them. You know, it was being transmitted to the United States. Send us bazookas, send us weapons. That's all we want. We don't want your soldiers. And then suddenly the radio would be cut off because the radio station was attacked by a Russian tank. So we were all very deeply moved by that. And the crushing of the Hungarian Revolution didn't leave us despondent, although, you know, we felt very bitter about the loss of life and the loss of a wonderful potentiality that existed, you know, of a new democratic type of socialism. But it made us doubt that you could really homogenize the United States, that the Orwellian scenario of complete adaptation, you see, to the authoritarian social order that was being introduced very gradually by American affluence and by American suburbanization and so forth, that this was now in question. For the first time, we really began to seriously question whether we were, in fact, the last generation of revolutionaries, because of these young people who had risen up and knew no other society but that was the Hungarian world that was controlled by the Russian army and by the Stalinist state. So already we began to feel a ferment after 1956. And it percolated in the United States as well, not only in Europe, where there were also uprisings in Eastern Europe to one degree or another, in East Germany and elsewhere. Women's Strike for Peace, for example, was formed, and that organization has been almost totally forgotten. I just recently saw a book on the subject where women got together by the thousands and networked all through the United States to stop nuclear bomb tests because of the fallout, an issue that was very dear to my heart, as I indicated earlier. They began to also speak in terms of demilitarization, because the Cold War was still in had a very heated form. And one has yet to remember that tanks had to confront each other in Berlin, where people actually thought the war would break out, and again later on in the Bay of Pigs invasion, where people became almost hysterical about the danger of war. I think this was in 1962. My memory is correct, and I alluded to that already. But very important internally in the United States, a movement began to develop that laid the groundwork, I think, for the New Left, at least the activist New Left. There was enough theoretical ferment going on to begin with now. Suddenly people like, you'll have to help me here on this.
Herbert Marcuse?
No, not Marcuse. Marcuse was totally unknown. He was just really, C. Wright Mills. C. Wright Mills began to impact on young intellectuals everywhere. A periodical later appeared greatly inspired by him called Studies on the Left.